Hey guys, tonight we're stepping back into the heat of the Aztec Empire, one of the most advanced civilizations of ancient Mesoamerica. Imagine this. It's midday, and the sun is beating down relentlessly on the stone streets of Tenochtitlan. You can feel the heat radiating from the ground as the air shimmers with intensity. The kind of sun that makes your skin prickle just thinking about it. The Aztecs, well, they didn't have air conditioning, so they had to get creative in surviving this constant heat. And let's face it, if you were transported back to their time, you probably wouldn't survive the heat without a solid wardrobe. And I mean, really, you wouldn't. Trust me. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Also, drop your location and time in the comments. I'm curious to know where you are as we get into this. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The Aztecs lived in a world where surviving the heat wasn't just about feeling uncomfortable. It was about life and death. The brutal sun that powered through the sky wasn't a mere inconvenience. It was a constant threat. They lived in a high-altitude valley surrounded by mountains, which gave them some relief from extreme heat at night. But in the daytime, the sunlight was intense. So how did the Aztecs, with no modern technology, adapt to this environment? How did they protect themselves from the sweltering sun that could burn and dehydrate them so quickly? The answer, as we're about to discover, lies in their fashion. Yes, the clothes they wore were designed not just for beauty or status, but for survival. Now, let's talk about the heat itself. Tenochtitlan, where the heart of Aztec life unfolded, was positioned in a basin at an altitude of about 7,000 feet above sea level. You might think that high elevation would give them some reprieve from the heat, but it didn't. Daytime temperatures could reach 85 degrees, 29 degrees or higher. But it wasn't the actual temperature alone that made it unbearable. The combination of thin air, high altitude, and relentless direct sunlight created an environment where staying cool was a constant challenge. The Aztecs had to manage this challenge, and they did so through their clothing, resourcefulness, and a deep understanding of how to interact with the natural world around them. Historians still argue whether the Aztecs truly invented their fashion solely as a practical response to the heat, or whether there was a deeper, symbolic reason for their choices. Whatever the case, their garments were carefully designed to protect them from the sun, regulate body temperature, and avoid overheating, all while maintaining a connection to their cultural beliefs. Let's dive into how they achieved this, starting with the garments themselves. Now, let's start with the basics. Clothing. You might think of ancient civilizations and picture elaborate robes or heavy tunics. But the Aztecs, they were all about comfort and practicality, especially when it came to surviving the brutal heat of the day. Their clothing wasn't just a matter of style, it was a matter of life and death. And in the case of the Aztecs, clothing meant protection. The core of the typical Aztec outfit consisted of simple, lightweight materials designed to keep the wearer cool. One of the primary materials used in Aztec clothing was cotton. Yes, cotton, the same fabric we all know today. But it wasn't like the cotton you might find in your average modern shirt. No, the Aztecs were masters at weaving the fluff from the cotton plant into breathable, light textiles perfect for surviving the intense heat. Aztec men typically wore a garment known as a maxtlatl, a type of loincloth made from cotton. It was a simple piece of cloth that wrapped around the waist and between the legs, leaving the upper body exposed to the sun's rays. But here's the interesting part. The maxtlatl wasn't just a piece of fabric for comfort. It was also an essential part of Aztec fashion and functionality. It allowed the skin to breathe, reducing the risk of heat stroke, and it could be adjusted depending on how hot the weather was. The way the loincloth was tied, however, also had a symbolic meaning in Aztec culture. Depending on the style and how it was worn, it could signal the wearer's social status or role in society. Women, on the other hand, wore a hupil, a simple cotton tunic that reached down to the knees or even the ankles. It was essentially a sleeveless shift, made from the same breathable cotton that their male counterparts used. But just like the maxtlatl, the huipil wasn't just for practicality. The design, length, and color of the garment were often indicators of a woman's social status, and patterns woven into the fabric could carry specific meanings. Historians still argue whether the design of these garments was purely based on comfort and survival, or if it was also a way to establish identity and hierarchy. Some suggest that the simplicity of the clothing was a nod to the Aztecs' focus on the functionality of life, while others believe that even the most modest pieces of clothing carried a deeper, more spiritual symbolism. But it wasn't just the materials and styles that made Aztec clothing practical for surviving the heat. It was also about layering. The Aztecs, especially the nobles and warriors, didn't just wear one garment. They would often wear multiple layers, depending on the occasion. On particularly hot days, a simple cotton cloak might be draped over the shoulders to shield the skin from the harsh sun. But as temperatures rose, it would be discarded for comfort. In the evenings, after the intense heat had dissipated, they could wear layers again as a way to keep the chill of the desert night at bay. The use of cotton for layering made it possible to adapt to temperature fluctuations, ensuring that the Aztecs could endure both the heat of the day and the cooler nights. As you can imagine, the clothing choices of the Aztecs weren't just about staying cool. They were a clever blend of fashion, function, and symbolism. These garments, while simple, were designed with both the harsh environment and the culture's strict social codes in mind. Now, let's take a moment to look closer at one of the materials that made all this possible: cotton. So, let's zoom in on cotton. Today, we take this humble fabric for granted. It's in almost everything we wear. But for the Aztecs, cotton wasn't just a material for clothing. It was a vital resource that helped them survive in one of the most unforgiving climates imaginable. To say cotton was important to the Aztecs is an understatement. It was one of the core building blocks of their society, and it had a deep cultural significance that went far beyond its everyday use. Cotton was grown in vast quantities across the Aztec Empire. The most prized cotton was called xochipilli, which, according to some sources, was cultivated near the lakes around Tenochtitlan, where the wetland environment made it ideal for cotton cultivation. The soft, fluffy cotton fibers were spun into thread and then woven into textiles that could be used for clothing, trade, and even ceremonial purposes. The way the Aztecs processed and woven cotton into fabric was nothing short of a craft, a skill that took years to master. And let me tell you, the Aztecs didn't just wear any cotton fabric. They made sure it was the best. In fact, the quality of the cotton was so important that only the most elite weavers could create the finest, softest textiles. The nobles, priests, and warriors were often outfitted in clothing made from this luxurious fabric, while the common folk had to make do with the simpler, coarser versions. The intricacy of the weaves also varied. Some textiles were plain, while others were decorated with beautiful designs or dyed in vibrant colors. The Aztecs loved their colors, and they believed that different colors carried distinct meanings, from blue representing the heavens to red symbolizing life and sacrifice. Historians still argue whether the Aztecs had a completely self-sufficient cotton industry, or whether they had trade networks with other civilizations to acquire better quality cotton. Some believe they were masters of cultivation and production, while others suggest they traded with nearby cultures to get the most desirable fibers. Either way, cotton was a game-changer in terms of fashion and survival for the Aztecs. It wasn't just a material, it was a way of life. Another interesting aspect of Aztec cotton use is its role in their economy. Cotton wasn't only used for clothing, as you might expect. It was also traded extensively. Cotton cloth became one of the key commodities in the Aztec marketplace, alongside items like cacao beans and precious metals. Traders would bring cotton to market and exchange it for goods, which means that the everyday cotton items worn by the Aztecs were also valuable trade goods. The Aztecs even had a currency system based on cotton, which was so prized that it had a direct impact on their economy. But cotton wasn't the only thing that made the Aztec garments so effective in protecting against the heat. They also knew how to use other resources at their disposal, like plant fibers and even animal skins, to create clothing that was both lightweight and durable. While cotton was the most common material, they occasionally used other textiles, such as magi fibers, which came from the same plant used to make the famous agave drink pulque. This type of textile was stiffer and thicker, but still breathable, perfect for creating cloaks or other layered garments that help protect the skin from the sun. By weaving these materials into garments designed for both comfort and survival, the Aztecs managed to thrive in an environment that could easily wear others down. They weren't just making clothing, they were engineering survival gear. The practicality of these garments, designed specifically to cope with the heat, showed just how resourceful and intelligent the Aztec people were. In fact, the way they used cotton and other materials goes to show that the Aztecs didn't see fashion and functionality as separate. Their clothing wasn't a mere decoration. It was part of a larger strategy to survive and prosper in a tough world. And this isn't even the whole story. There's more to how Aztec clothing was tied to their social structure, their beliefs, and their identity. Historians still debate how much of the Aztec society's reliance on cotton was a result of practical necessity versus the cultural significance attached to the material. Was cotton revered simply for its physical properties? Or did it hold deeper religious meaning in the lives of the Aztecs? Some argue that cotton, as a product of the earth, was imbued with spiritual importance, while others suggest it was more of a practical response to a very real challenge, the heat. So, now that we've covered the importance of cotton, let's move on to how these Aztec outfits were put together. These garments didn't just hang loosely on the body. They were strategically designed to protect from the sun, and they could also be easily adjusted to suit the weather. And there's a little more to the story than just clothes. This is where things get fascinating. Now that we've looked at the materials, let's get into the nuts and bolts of how the Aztec people actually wore their clothes. There's a certain simplicity to the Aztec outfit. Yet, that simplicity was part of its brilliance, for everyday use. Most Aztec men and women wore basic garments that provided maximum comfort and allowed for fluid movement. No heavy layers, no thick fabrics, just breathable materials that kept them cool under the blistering sun. For men, the typical clothing was the maxtlatl, a kind of loincloth made from the soft, breathable cotton we just talked about. It was a single strip of cloth that wrapped around the waist and through the legs, leaving the upper body exposed. But don't think for a second that the maxtlatl was just a basic piece of cloth. It was actually a versatile garment on particularly hot days. The Aztec man would wear just the maxtlatl. But when the heat was slightly more bearable, he might add a tilmatli, a rectangular, often decorated cloth that he draped over his shoulders or around his waist. The tilmatli was sometimes used to shield the body from the sun, but it also served as a kind of all-purpose garment for carrying things or even covering up when needed. It's important to note that the maxtlatl wasn't just about surviving the heat. It was also part of the social structure of the Aztec Empire. How a man wore his loincloth, the way it was tied, the kind of decoration it carried, could say a lot about his status. Warriors, for instance, might wear a maxtlatl decorated with special embroidery or adornments to indicate their rank or achievements in battle. Some maxtlatls featured intricate designs and bold colors, a way for men to display their social position through their clothing. Now, for the women. Their everyday clothing followed a similar pattern, but with some key differences. Women generally wore a hupil, which was a simple, loose-fitting tunic that reached from the shoulders down to the knees or even the ankles, made from lightweight cotton. The huipil kept women cool and comfortable during the heat of the day. The simplicity of the huipil didn't mean it was plain, quite the opposite. In fact, women's huipils could be richly decorated with woven patterns and vibrant colors that represented their social standing. Just as with the men's maxtlatl, the design, color, and pattern of the hupil could signal a woman's place in Aztec society. Historians still debate whether the huipil was exclusively worn by women of the common class, with noble women opting for more elaborate garments, or whether its basic design was universally adopted across all social classes. Some argue that the huipil was a practical garment for everyone, while others suggest that elite women might have worn a more luxurious version made from finer cotton or adorned with more elaborate embellishments. Either way, the huipil was a versatile garment, one that could be worn in both the heat of the day and the cooler nights, offering protection from the sun while maintaining a connection to Aztec cultural values. One fascinating thing about the huipil, and this applies to all Aztec clothing, is that it wasn't just about function. Yes, it kept the body cool, but it also helped establish a person's identity. This is where the relationship between the clothing and social status becomes clearer. Certain colors, patterns, and weaving techniques were symbolic and tied to specific roles in Aztec society. For instance, bright red might represent life or even sacrifice, while the use of more muted colors was associated with the common folk. This wasn't just a practical choice. It was an expression of social stratification. But here's the kicker. Even though the huipil and maxtlatl might seem like basic, everyday wear, these garments could carry a level of craftsmanship and symbolism that was extraordinary. They were more than just clothing. They were a reflection of the wearer's place in the world. Of course, the everyday clothing wasn't the only way the Aztecs dealt with the heat. After all, they didn't spend all day just walking around in a maxtlatl or hupil. When they needed additional protection from the sun or when the heat became unbearable, they would often use cloaks or ponchos, usually made of the same lightweight cotton. These garments were perfect for draping over the shoulders or wrapping around the body to shield from the midday sun. But when the temperature soared, These cloaks were often discarded in favor of lighter, more breathable outfits. Another fascinating part of the clothing strategy was the ability to layer. On particularly hot days, the Aztecs would often remove layers, leaving only their loincloths or simple tunics. But when the sun began to dip and the cool of the evening settled in, they could add cloaks or other garments for warmth. The flexibility of these garments was key. They weren't just designed for one specific temperature or climate condition, but were meant to be adjusted throughout the day. Historians still debate whether layering was a deliberate cultural practice, a practical necessity, or both. While some believe it was a reflection of the Aztecs' practicality in adapting to fluctuating temperatures, others suggest it was an expression of their belief in duality, a concept deeply rooted in Aztec spirituality. Maybe it was a combination of both, a reflection of the society's spiritual beliefs and their need for function in an unforgiving environment. The beauty of the Aztec clothing system is that it didn't simply serve one purpose, it served many. It was about comfort, protection from the elements, and reflecting one's identity. And that's just the start of how Aztec clothing evolved as a response to the relentless heat they faced. Now that we've explored the basic garments, let's talk about the colors and symbolism woven into these Aztec clothes. Clothing wasn't just for function. It was also a powerful tool for signaling identity, status, and even religious affiliation. Each thread and dye had meaning. The Aztecs weren't just thinking about staying cool. They were also communicating their place in a complex and hierarchical society through their fashion choices. One of the most striking features of Aztec clothing was the use of color. For the Aztecs, colors weren't just decorative. They were deeply symbolic. Bright hues like red, blue, and yellow weren't just chosen because they looked pretty. They held religious significance and conveyed deeper meanings. Red, for example, symbolized life, energy, and sacrifice. It was a color deeply connected to the god Huitzilopochtli, the god of war and the sun, and was often worn by warriors and priests involved in ceremonies that invoked the god's power. The color blue, on the other hand, was associated with the heavens and the water gods, while green was the color of fertility and abundance. It wasn't uncommon for an Aztec noble to wear garments in specific colors that indicated their role in society or their dedication to a particular deity. But color wasn't just a matter of symbolism. It was also tied to class and status. Commoners might wear simpler, more muted colors, while the wealthy and elite donned garments in vivid, rich hues. The use of vibrant colors was restricted by social class. Only those with the right to wear the best garments could flaunt them in public. And even the patterns woven into the fabrics had their own meanings. Some garments were embroidered with designs that represented gods, animals, or natural elements, which carried messages about the wearer's identity and role in the larger world. One particularly fascinating feature of Aztec clothing was the use of feathers. While feathers were primarily associated with headdresses, they were also woven into garments, particularly those worn by the elite. The Aztecs prized exotic bird feathers, especially those from the quetzal bird, which had vibrant green feathers and was considered sacred. These feathers were so valuable that they were used not only in ceremonial garb, but also as currency in the form of feathered garments and accessories. The feathers weren't just for decoration. They were a way to show off wealth, power, and divine favor. The use of feathers in clothing was so sacred that it was often restricted to the nobility and priests, further solidifying the rigid class distinctions in Aztec society. Historians still debate whether the use of feathers in clothing was primarily symbolic, or if it was more about practical adornment. Some argue that the feathers had a deeply spiritual significance, representing the gods or divine power, while others suggest that they were simply a luxury item, a way for the elite to flaunt their wealth and status. Either way, the feathers became a key part of the visual language of Aztec clothing, signaling not just social class, but spiritual alignment and access to divine protection. Beyond the feathers, the designs and materials in Aztec clothing also had practical purposes. For example, the colors used in garments were often derived from natural dyes, such as cochineal, a red dye made from insects, and indigo, which produced a deep blue color. These dyes were labor-intensive to create, meaning that only the wealthiest could afford garments dyed in these vibrant colors. This, in turn, reinforced the social structure of the Aztec Empire, where access to fine materials and dyes was controlled by a select few. In addition to the symbolism of colors, the use of certain materials was also deeply tied to the wearer's spiritual identity. For example, cotton was considered sacred because it was believed to be a gift from the gods. The Aztecs believed that cotton fibers represented the intertwining of life forces, natural, divine, and human. This belief made cotton clothing more than just a practical garment. It was a tangible connection between the wearer and the gods. The use of cotton in clothing could, therefore, have spiritual implications, reinforcing the idea that clothing wasn't just a tool for survival, but an integral part of the Aztec worldview. Of course, it wasn't just the colors and patterns that had significance. The fit and style of garments also played an important role in communicating the wearer's status and identity. Aztec nobles were often seen wearing more complex outfits, such as elaborate feathered capes, intricate headdresses, and elaborately embroidered tunics. Warriors, too, had specialized clothing, often adorned with symbols of their victories in battle. These warriors would wear feathered cloaks and headbands, items that marked them as elite members of society, often with bright red or yellow to signify their connection to the gods of war. Historians still argue over how the Aztecs used clothing to express their complex cosmology. Was it simply a practical tool for maintaining social order and hierarchy? Or did clothing have a deeper, more spiritual meaning tied to the Aztecs' beliefs about the gods and the universe? While we might never have a definitive answer, what's clear is that the clothing of the Aztecs went far beyond mere survival. It was a statement about identity, social status, religion, and the divine forces that shaped their world. Now that we've delved into the role of color, patterns, and materials in an Aztec fashion, let's look at how the jewelry and adornments they wore played a significant part in both their daily lives and in their cultural rituals. So far, we've explored the essential clothing the Aztecs wore to survive the heat. But what about the extra touches? Aztec clothing wasn't just about fabric. It was also about the fine details. Jewelry and adornments played a huge role in Aztec society, not only for enhancing one's appearance, but also for spiritual and practical purposes. From feathers to gemstones to intricately crafted pieces of gold and jade, these adornments weren't just accessories. They were a symbol of power, divine favor, and social status. The Aztecs didn't have the same modern concept of jewelry as we do today. For them, adornments were woven into the fabric of their everyday lives and held deep religious and cultural significance. Many of the pieces of jewelry they wore were more than just decoration. They had spiritual and protective meanings. In fact, many of the materials used to create Aztec jewelry were considered sacred. Gold, for instance, was associated with the sun god Tonatiuh, and it was believed to have divine powers. Gold jewelry was often reserved for the elite, nobles, warriors, and priests, who wore these pieces as a connection to the gods. One of the most fascinating aspects of Aztec jewelry was the use of feathers, a material that was not only used in clothing, but also in their adornments. Feathers were extremely important in Aztec culture, symbolizing wealth, status, and divine protection. The feathers used in jewelry came from some of the most beautiful and rare birds in the region, such as the quetzal and the hummingbird. These feathers were painstakingly gathered and woven into intricate pieces of jewelry, including headdresses, earrings, necklaces, and even bracelets. Feathers were considered a direct link to the gods, especially the feathered serpent god Quetzalcoatl, one of the most revered deities in Aztec religion. Wearing feathered adornments was not just an aesthetic choice. It was an assertion of divine favor and a symbol of one's connection to the gods. Warriors, particularly those who had achieved great feats in battle, often wore elaborate feathered headpieces as a sign of their status and power. The more impressive the feathers, often adorned with precious stones like jade, the higher the social rank of the wearer. Speaking of jade, this precious stone was another key material used in Aztec jewelry. Jade was revered not only for its beauty, but also for its durability and connection to the gods. It was often used in the creation of intricate pendants, earrings, and rings. Because of its rarity, jade was a material that signified wealth and power. The Aztecs believed that jade could protect the wearer from harm, and as a result, it was frequently used in burial rituals, with the deceased often being adorned with jade jewelry to ensure a safe passage to the afterlife. Historians still argue over whether jade was more symbolic in religious practices, or whether its use was primarily an expression of social status. Some scholars suggest that jade's value lay more in its spiritual significance, particularly its associations with fertility and the underworld, while others claim that it was seen primarily as a luxury material, a marker of wealth and prestige. Regardless, jade jewelry was reserved for the elite, further reinforcing the class system in Aztec society. But it wasn't just the elite who wore jewelry. Commoners, too, had access to simpler forms of adornment. These could be crafted from less expensive materials, such as shells, stones, and bones, but they still carried meaning. For example, some commoners wore simple earplugs made of wood or bone, often decorated with small carvings or inlays. These earplugs could indicate a person's occupation or social role, much like the jewelry of the elite signaled power and privilege. Interestingly, the Aztecs also used jewelry and adornments as protective amulets. Small figurines of gods and deities were often worn as pendants or carried in pouches to safeguard the wearer from harm. These amulets were believed to offer the wearer divine protection, and the choice of deity varied depending on the individual's needs. A warrior might carry an amulet of Huitzilopochtli, the god of war, for courage and strength, while a farmer might carry one of Tlaloc, the god of rain, for good harvests. This custom highlights the deep connection between the Aztecs' daily lives and their religious beliefs. In addition to the decorative and spiritual value of jewelry, these adornments also had a very practical function. For example, many warriors wore ear spools, which were large, heavy pieces of jewelry inserted into the earlobes. These spools were often made from gold, jade, or other precious materials and could weigh quite a bit. While they were undoubtedly a symbol of wealth and status, they also served a functional purpose. The weight of the spools was believed to make the ears more sensitive to the sounds of battle, allowing the warrior to hear more clearly. In this way, jewelry was not just about appearances, it had a deeper, practical meaning that was tied to the Aztecs' understanding of the world around them. Historians still debate the cultural significance of certain pieces of jewelry. For example, while the ear spools were clearly a status symbol, some scholars suggest that their weight was also symbolic of the burdens and responsibilities of leadership. Others argue that they had a purely functional purpose, helping to enhance the wearer's senses in battle. But what's clear is that jewelry played an integral role in Aztec life, offering protection, signaling status, and connecting the wearer to the gods. As we continue to explore how the Aztecs dressed to survive the heat, the next step is to take a look at how hats and headdresses played their part in the overall fashion scheme. Let's now turn our attention to the hats and headdresses the Aztecs wore, not just for shade, but as important cultural markers, as you might expect. Hats weren't just accessories for the Aztecs, they were loaded with symbolism, social significance, and practicality, designed to shield from the sun while marking a person's status and role within the community. These headpieces were an essential part of Aztec clothing, especially for the elite, and were crafted with as much care and thought as the rest of their outfits. The most recognizable of Aztec headgear was the headdress, particularly the elaborate feathered creations worn by warriors, nobles, and priests. These headdresses, often large and extravagant, were designed not just to protect the wearer from the sun, but to display their connection to the gods and their social rank. One of the most famous examples of Aztec headdresses is the one worn by the emperor, which was adorned with colorful feathers, particularly from the sacred Quetzal bird. The Quetzal feathers, with their vibrant green and iridescent quality, were highly prized and reserved for the highest-ranking individuals, as they were believed to be a direct link to the divine. Warriors, too, wore striking headgear. A warrior's headdress could indicate their achievements in battle, with each feather added representing a victory or a particular honor. The more elaborate the headpiece, the greater the prestige of the wearer. For instance, an elite warrior might wear a headdress made from feathers of exotic birds, such as the quetzal or the cotinga, to signify their special relationship with the gods and the success of their military campaigns. These headdresses were not just beautiful, but also deeply meaningful, as they connected the warriors to the gods of the skies and the earth. Historians still debate whether these headdresses were purely ceremonial, or whether they had functional roles during battle. While many believe they were primarily symbols of honor and status, others argue that the feathered headpieces may have had a more practical purpose. Some suggest that the headdresses were designed to make warriors appear larger and more intimidating on the battlefield, serving a psychological function as much as a decorative one. Regardless of their exact purpose, the headdresses were an undeniable mark of prestige and power, signaling the importance of the wearer both in the eyes of the Aztec people and in the spiritual world. Now, not everyone in Aztec society wore these elaborate headdresses. Commoners typically wore simpler head coverings, often made of woven cotton or palm leaves, designed to shield them from the sun's harsh rays without the same level of ornamentation. These practical hats were typically worn by laborers, farmers, and those working outside, offering essential protection while allowing for maximum breathability and comfort. These simpler hats were still significant, though, as they marked the wearer's place in society, practical and functional, but without the flair of the elite. One particular type of hat, commonly worn by the Aztecs, was the tlacochtli, a kind of wide-brimmed hat. These hats were often made of plant fibers, and their design provided ample shade for the face and neck, helping protect from the intense sunlight. They weren't flashy. Instead, they were simple and utilitarian, created to provide comfort and shade. But again, these hats weren't just about practicality. They also marked the wearer as a part of the working class, a person whose role in society was tied to the land and labor. Interestingly, the material used for these simpler hats varied depending on the region. In areas where cotton was more plentiful, hats were often made from tightly woven cotton, while in other regions, palm leaves and other plant fibers might have been used. The shape and style of the hat could also change depending on the person's occupation. For example, farmers might wear a low, wide-brimmed hat to shield their faces from the sun, while artisans working in more protected spaces might opt for a lighter, smaller hat. But despite the simplicity of these hats, they were still important symbols within Aztec society. They marked the wearer's role in society, and while they didn't carry the same grandeur as the feathered headdresses worn by the elite, they were still an essential part of the cultural fabric that kept the Aztec Empire functioning smoothly. The hats may have been simpler, but they served their purpose, shielding the wearer from the elements while signifying their place within the social hierarchy. Historians still argue over the social implications of the simpler hats. Some believe that these head coverings were just practical tools for dealing with the harsh environment, while others suggest that they were subtle markers of class and status, distinguishing those who worked the land from the elite who might wear more elaborate headdresses. Regardless of the debate, it's clear that hats, in whatever form they took, were a critical part of Aztec life. Now, let's move on to a more unexpected aspect of Aztec clothing: their footwear. While we often think of shoes as an afterthought in ancient cultures, the Aztecs took their sandals seriously, and they played a significant role in both practicality and status. Let's take a look at how the Aztecs used their footwear to survive the heat and maintain their place in society. Let's now explore the footwear of the Aztecs, which, believe it or not, played a crucial role in both their survival and their status within the empire. When we think of ancient footwear, sandals often come to mind. But in the case of the Aztecs, their sandals weren't just for comfort. They were a practical and symbolic part of their daily life. These sandals were designed with the hot environment in mind, offering both protection and breathability, ensuring that the wearer could navigate the stony streets and uneven ground of Tenochtitlan without overheating or getting injured. The most common type of footwear in the Aztec world was the Xochipilli sandal, a simple yet effective design made from woven plant fibers. These sandals were durable, lightweight, and, most importantly, allowed the feet to breathe, which was essential for dealing with the heat of the day. The plant fibers used were often sourced from the maguey plant, which was also used to create various textiles and even the famous agave drink, pulque. The maguey fibers were woven together to create sturdy soles that could withstand the rough conditions of the Aztec streets, from the rocky paths to the muddy canals. Interestingly, the sandals' soles were often designed with an open weave, allowing air to circulate and preventing the feet from becoming too hot or sweaty. This was a huge advantage in the hot, arid climate of the Aztec Valley. Think of it as an ancient version of modern-day breathable athletic shoes, designed to keep the feet cool and comfortable while navigating a busy city. Now, while the common sandals were made of maguey fibers or woven reeds, the elite had more elaborate footwear, often made with finer materials. Wealthier Aztecs, such as nobles, priests, and high-ranking warriors, wore sandals with decorative elements, sometimes made of leather or adorned with feathers and jewels. These sandals were more than just functional. They were a statement of wealth, power, and prestige. The more intricate the sandal, the more it signaled the wearer's high social status. For example, the sandals worn by warriors often featured additional features, like feathers or golden embellishments to mark their achievements in battle. These details weren't just for show. They were deeply symbolic. Some warriors wore sandals that had been decorated with precious stones or intricate weaving, marking their importance in Aztec society, as with other aspects of Aztec dress. The way the sandals were decorated could communicate the wearer's role, whether they were a warrior, a noble, or a priest. Historians still debate the symbolic role of sandals in Aztec society. Some scholars argue that the sandals were primarily functional, designed to help people survive the physical demands of daily life, while others suggest that footwear, like other clothing, was a status symbol. Did the sandals represent class and rank? Or were they purely a practical necessity, most likely? They served both purposes, providing comfort and protection while also signaling the wearer's social position within the hierarchy of the empire. An interesting thing to note about Aztec footwear is that sandals were not just worn for everyday activities. During certain rituals and ceremonies, footwear played an important role in the symbolism of the event. For example, priests who performed sacrifices often wore specially designed sandals that were adorned with sacred symbols or decorated with materials like jade or turquoise. These ceremonial sandals were an important part of the spiritual meaning behind the rituals, signifying the connection between the physical world and the divine. In addition to sandals, the Aztecs also wore foot coverings during colder times or special occasions. These foot coverings, which were typically made from animal hides or woven fibers, helped keep the feet warm during the cooler nights or in ceremonial settings. These were particularly important for the priests and nobles, who would often engage in religious ceremonies during the night when the temperature could drop significantly. But let's get back to the sandals for a second. Despite their simplicity, these shoes were essential for the Aztecs' survival in such a challenging environment. With all the walking, navigating canals, and performing labor-intensive tasks, sturdy sandals were a must. And the fact that they were designed to keep the feet cool, dry, and comfortable meant that they were just as important as any other part of their clothing. Now, stepping away from the purely functional side of footwear, there's also the fact that the footwear was an expression of Aztec worldview. The Aztecs placed a lot of emphasis on movement and the Earth's cyclical nature. The act of walking, of moving from one place to another, was significant in their worldview. By creating sandals that allowed for free movement, they were making a statement about their connection to the Earth, to the gods, and to the seasons. It's a reminder that even in something as simple as footwear, the Aztecs were infusing practicality with deep cultural and spiritual meaning. So, with the importance of footwear in mind, it's time to look at another crucial element of surviving the Aztec heat: sunscreen. While you might be familiar with modern sunscreens, the Aztecs had their own unique ways of protecting their skin from the harsh sun. Let's explore how they managed to keep their skin safe and healthy in an era without SPF lotions. Now that we've covered footwear, let's turn our attention to an essential aspect of Aztec life that might surprise you: sunscreen. Yes, that's right. While the Aztecs didn't have modern sunblocks, They had their own ingenious ways of protecting their skin from the blistering sun. Think about it. With the sun relentlessly beating down on them day after day, they needed more than just light clothing to survive without burning or becoming severely sunburned. And they found a way to adapt using the natural resources around them. One of the most interesting and, let's be honest, kind of gross ways the Aztecs protected their skin was by using crocodile dung. Yep, you read that right. Crocodile dung, which was rich in oils and properties that help prevent skin damage, was applied as a form of sunscreen. While this might sound odd to us today, the Aztecs had a deep understanding of their environment and how to use what was available to them. They knew the value of protecting their skin from the sun's harmful rays, and crocodile dung, combined with other natural ingredients, became a part of their daily skin care routine. Historians still argue whether crocodile dung was the primary method of sun protection, or if it was just one of many remedies the Aztecs used. Some suggest that it was a practical and effective solution, given the availability of crocodiles in their territory, while others point out that the dung might have had additional benefits, such as keeping insects away. Either way, it was definitely an unusual yet resourceful approach to sun protection. But the use of crocodile dung wasn't the only method they used to shield their skin from the sun. They also relied on natural plant oils and clays that offered similar protective qualities. One of the most important plant-based remedies was the use of maguey, the same plant used to make their sandals, fibers, and pulque. The leaves of the maguey plant were used to create an ointment that could be rubbed onto the skin to protect against the sun. The maguey-based balm acted as a sunscreen by creating a barrier against UV rays, helping to prevent sunburn and skin damage. Another natural substance the Aztecs used for skin care was aloe vera, which, as we know today, is still famous for its soothing and healing properties. The Aztecs had long used aloe vera not just as a treatment for burns, but as a way to cool and protect the skin from sun exposure. The gel from the aloe vera plant could be applied directly to the skin, helping to keep it hydrated and preventing sunburn. Historians still debate whether these skincare practices were part of an overall ritualistic or health-related tradition. Some believe that skincare was strictly functional, designed purely to protect from the sun, while others suggest that it had deeper cultural and religious significance. For example, some scholars argue that certain natural remedies, like the use of maguey, had spiritual meanings, connecting the wearer to the earth and the gods. It's possible that these natural treatments were seen as gifts from the gods, giving the Aztecs not only practical sun protection, but also a spiritual connection to the natural world. Interestingly, the Aztecs didn't just focus on protecting their bodies from the sun, they also thought about their hair. Remember that hairstyles were a significant part of Aztec identity, with different hairstyles signifying social class, age, and even spiritual status. To prevent hair from becoming damaged or dried out by the intense heat, they would often use natural oils and balms, such as those derived from coconut or maguey, to keep their hair shiny and healthy. This wasn't just about appearance. Hair care was an integral part of maintaining the body's overall health, especially when the environment posed so many challenges. Of course, the use of these natural sun protection methods was not just limited to the elite. Commoners, too, had access to some form of skin care, though their remedies might have been more basic or practical. They might have used simpler oils or herbs to protect their skin, but the overall importance of protecting oneself from the harsh sun was understood across all levels of Aztec society. As with much of Aztec culture, There's still some debate among historians about the exact methods used for skincare. Did the wealthy use more luxurious substances, or was everyone, from the poorest farmer to the highest priest, using similar remedies? Some believe that class played a significant role in determining which ingredients were used, while others argue that the use of natural remedies was widely available to all Aztecs. What we do know, however, is that the Aztecs were incredibly resourceful in their methods of sun protection, making use of the natural resources available to them to protect their skin from the elements. Now that we've explored the various ways the Aztecs kept their skin safe, let's take a step back and consider how their overall fashion choices were designed to deal with the intense heat and sun. While clothing, jewelry, and sunscreen all played a role in their survival, the Aztecs had a unique approach to adapting to their environment, using everything from materials to rituals to make it through the scorching days. Now that we've covered how the Aztecs protected their skin from the intense sun, let's step back and look at the bigger picture, how their entire fashion system was designed to keep them safe, comfortable, and functional in the sweltering heat of their world. It wasn't just about choosing the right materials or applying the right lotions. It was about creating a whole wardrobe designed with one goal in mind: survival. The Aztecs were masters of adapting to their environment, and this skill was reflected in the clever ways they used clothing and accessories to keep cool and stay healthy. As we've already seen, cotton played a central role in this, providing the lightweight, breathable fabric that made up most of the Aztec wardrobe. But the choice of cotton wasn't purely about comfort, it was about understanding the environment and how to thrive in it. The Aztecs knew that heat would be their constant companion, and they worked with the materials available to them to create clothing that would breathe and wick away sweat. This attention to fabric choice, particularly cotton, was critical because it allowed the wearer to stay cool, even when walking long distances under the harsh midday sun. But it wasn't just the fabric that mattered. The cut and design of the clothing were just as important. The open, airy style of the loincloth and huipil, the tunic worn by women, helped keep the body free from heavy, heat-trapping fabrics. These garments left plenty of room for air to circulate, reducing the risk of overheating. The practical nature of these designs ensured that the Aztecs could move freely and comfortably, whether they were working, fighting, or walking through the bustling city of Tenochtitlan. As we've mentioned before, layering was another key factor in Aztec fashion. On extremely hot days, the tilmatli, a rectangular cloth often worn as a cloak, would be discarded to prevent overheating. But as temperatures fluctuated throughout the day, a light cloak or garment could be added to protect against the evening chill or to shield from the intense rays of the sun during midday. This adaptability, the ability to strip down or cover up depending on the weather, helped the Aztecs cope with the dramatic changes in temperature they faced throughout the day. Layering wasn't just practical, it was also a cultural expression. The design and number of layers someone wore often depended on their social rank. The nobility might wear additional decorative cloaks made from luxurious materials like feathers or fine cotton, signaling their elite status. These garments were often designed with elaborate patterns and vibrant colors, while commoners kept things simple with only a basic loincloth or huipil. The layering system not only ensured comfort in different weather conditions, but also served as a visual cue for the person's place in Aztec society. Historians still debate whether Aztec clothing was primarily designed for survival, or whether it had a deeper, more symbolic meaning. Some argue that clothing was a practical necessity, crafted with functionality in mind and shaped by the environment. Others suggest that every garment, from the humble loincloth to the elaborate feathered headdresses, was a symbolic statement about the wearer's relationship to the gods, their social class, and their role in the universe. In truth, it was likely both. Clothing served as both a survival tool and a cultural expression, intertwined in a complex way that reflected the Aztec worldview. Aztec fashion also placed a significant emphasis on mobility. For a civilization that valued movement, whether in battle, in ceremonial rituals, or even in daily activities, clothing that allowed for ease of motion was paramount. The simplicity of the loincloth, the flexibility of the hoop hill, and the open design of sandals all allowed for the freedom needed to perform daily tasks, rituals, and even combat. This mobility was essential not only for physical survival, but also for the spiritual practices the Aztecs followed. Many of their rituals involved dancing, offering, and moving between sacred spaces, and their clothing supported this active lifestyle. Another factor that helped the Aztecs deal with the heat was their adaptation to the environment. The design of Tenochtitlan, built on islands in a lake, meant that the Aztecs also had to contend with water. The canals and causeways that linked different parts of the city were an essential part of their infrastructure. And the people of Tenochtitlan had adapted to their environment in a way that minimized the burden of the heat. Their clothing was designed for mobility in this unique landscape, making it easier for people to move through the city by boat, on foot, or by other means. And let's not forget the practical aspects of their clothing choices in this environment. Many Aztecs worked in the fields, where the sun's heat could be even more unbearable. There, clothing that kept them cool and protected was absolutely vital. Farmers wore simple, lightweight garments that allowed them to work in the hot sun without becoming overheated. The maguey fiber sandals kept their feet protected, while the lightweight cotton clothing helped prevent heat stroke. When it was time to labor in the fields, the simplicity of their clothes allowed them to focus on the task at hand rather than the discomfort of heavy fabrics. Historians still debate whether the rural fashion of the Aztecs was markedly different from that of the city dwellers. Some argue that people living in rural areas had access to simpler clothing, while others suggest that the agricultural class would have had access to the same kinds of materials and designs as their urban counterparts. Either way, the clothing worn by both urbanites and rural folk was designed for practicality, offering maximum comfort while maintaining social distinctions. Now that we've explored how Aztec clothing was designed to survive the heat, let's take a step back and consider how the elite in Aztec society dressed, contrasting sharply with the everyday clothing of the commoners. Now that we've explored the ways Aztec clothing was designed for everyday survival in the heat, let's take a look at how the elite in Aztec society dressed. Because, as you might imagine, their clothing wasn't just about comfort and practicality. For the wealthy and powerful, clothing was an intricate symbol of status, identity, and divine favor. The elite in Aztec society had access to materials and styles that were a far cry from the simple cotton garments worn by commoners. And while these clothes still had the practical functions we've already discussed, they also had layers of meaning and purpose tied to the wearer's position in society. The most obvious distinction between the elite and commoners was the materials. While commoners wore simpler clothing made primarily of cotton, the elite had access to much more luxurious textiles. One of the most highly coveted materials was featherwork. The elite, especially the nobles and priests, would wear garments adorned with feathers from exotic birds such as quetzals and hummingbirds. These feathers were prized not just for their beauty, but for their divine associations. The Quetzal, in particular, was sacred to the Aztecs and was linked to the feathered serpent god Quetzalcoatl. The Quetzal's brilliant green feathers were seen as a symbol of the god's favor, and wearing these feathers was a clear marker of social rank. The featherwork on elite garments wasn't limited to small embellishments. Some garments were entirely crafted from feathers. One of the most striking examples of this was the elaborate feathered capes worn by Aztec nobility. These capes were woven from hundreds of brightly colored feathers, creating intricate patterns that reflected the wearer's status and connection to the gods. These feathered garments weren't just for ceremonial purposes. They were an essential part of the elite wardrobe and could be worn for everyday activities or special occasions. Another material that the elite had access to was cotton woven into finer fabrics. The wealthy wore finely spun cotton that was smoother and softer than the rougher cotton worn by the commoners. These fabrics were often dyed in vibrant, symbolic colors that indicated their wearer's rank. The use of red, blue, and purple, in particular, signified nobility, and the dyes used were often derived from rare and expensive sources, such as cochineal insects for red dye. The time and effort required to produce such fine cotton textiles made these garments not only a status symbol, but also a sign of the wearer's wealth and access to valuable resources. Historians still debate how much of the elite's clothing was purely for status versus practical use. Some argue that the use of feathered and decorated garments was primarily about making a statement, both to the gods and to society, while others suggest that these garments had a functional role in social rituals, such as those performed by priests or warriors. Either way, it's clear that the clothing of the elite was both beautiful and deeply symbolic, incorporating rich materials and intricate designs that set them apart from the common people. But it wasn't just the clothing itself that marked the elite's high status. It was also their accessories. In addition to feathered garments, the wealthy wore jewelry made from precious metals, stones, and shells. Gold was particularly favored, symbolizing wealth and divine favor, and it was often incorporated into earrings, necklaces, and headpieces. Gold jewelry wasn't just about aesthetics. It was a direct connection to the sun god, Tonatiuh, and wearing it was believed to offer protection and favor from the gods. The use of jade was also prominent, with jade jewelry worn by priests and the nobility, reinforcing their connection to the divine world. Warriors, in particular, had their own distinct clothing and adornments designed to reflect their victories and achievements. Feathered headdresses were a key part of the warriors' attire, marking them as elite members of society. These headdresses were often made from the feathers of rare birds, as we've mentioned, and were adorned with symbols of the gods or the warrior's achievements in battle. Each feather added to a warrior's headdress signified a successful campaign, making these pieces not just decoration, but also a public record of the warrior's accomplishments. What's fascinating about these warrior garments is that they weren't just for display. They had spiritual and protective meanings. The headdresses and armor, decorated with sacred feathers and symbols, were meant to make the wearer appear larger, more formidable, and spiritually powerful. Many warriors believed that the gods would recognize them by the symbols and feathers they wore, granting them divine protection on the battlefield. Historians still debate how much of the warrior's gear, particularly the feathered adornments, was tied to military strategy versus spiritual beliefs. While some argue that the bright colors and feathered adornments were purely ceremonial, others suggest that these features had a psychological impact on both the wearer and the enemy. The elaborate armor and headdresses were designed to instill fear in the enemy, signaling the warrior's divine strength and status. Let's not forget the role of religion in the elite's clothing. Priests, for instance, wore elaborate ceremonial garb, often decorated with feathers, jade, and gold, to perform rituals that were central to Aztec life. These garments were meant to reflect the wearer's close relationship with the gods, and the intricate designs were symbolic of divine power and favor. Priests also wore headdresses that were often more elaborate than those of the nobility or warriors, further reinforcing their spiritual significance. As with the rest of Aztec fashion, the clothing of the elite was not just about surviving the heat or the elements. It was about expressing their place in society, their connection to the divine, and their achievements. Everything, from the feathers in their capes to the gold in their jewelry, was a reflection of the elite's relationship with the gods and their social position. Now, let's move on to the feathers themselves. The symbolic material that was woven into nearly every aspect of Aztec fashion, from everyday wear to ceremonial attire. How did the Aztecs use these colorful feathers, and what did they represent? Let's now dive deeper into one of the most distinctive and symbolic materials in Aztec fashion: feathers. Feathers were not just decorative for the Aztecs. They were powerful symbols of connection to the divine, status, and even warfare. While feathers had practical uses, being woven into clothing for added decoration and texture, they were also highly symbolic and religiously significant. To the Aztecs, feathers weren't just beautiful. They were a direct link to the gods. The most revered feathers were those of the Quetzal bird, which had iridescent green feathers. The Quetzal, associated with the feathered serpent god Quetzalcoatl, was considered sacred. The bird's feathers were seen as divine, representing both the gods and the heavens. These feathers were so prized that they were used in the creation of some of the most elaborate and luxurious pieces of clothing, jewelry, and ceremonial garb worn by the elite. The more feathers you had in your garment, the higher your social standing, and the greater your perceived connection to the divine. But it wasn't just the Quetzal feathers that were important. The Aztecs used feathers from a wide variety of birds, and each type had its own significance. Hummingbird feathers, for instance, were associated with speed and agility and were often used by warriors to enhance their attire and armor. The Cotinga bird, with its vibrant blue feathers, was another prized bird whose feathers were used in headdresses and other adornments. In this way, feathers played a crucial role in distinguishing different roles within Aztec society, whether you were a warrior, a noble, or a priest. The type and number of feathers you wore could signify your position. Historians still debate how the Aztecs sourced these feathers. Some suggest that the birds were kept in aviaries and raised specifically for their feathers, while others argue that the feathers were collected through hunting and trade. Either way, the process of gathering and preparing the feathers was meticulous and time-consuming. Only the wealthiest and most powerful individuals could afford the elaborate feathered garments, which made feathers a key indicator of elite status. The creation of feathered garments was an incredibly skilled art form. Featherwork was a craft that required great expertise, as feathers were not simply sewn into fabric. The feathers had to be carefully arranged, glued, and woven into intricate patterns. For example, the most exquisite featherwork involved weaving feathers into capes, headdresses, and armbands. These pieces were often not just beautiful, they were designed to convey specific messages. The patterns could represent the gods, military victories, or celestial phenomena, and they helped communicate the wearer's role in society or the spiritual world. For warriors, the feathers had an additional significance. Feathers were not just worn as decoration. They had a symbolic connection to power and prowess. Feathered headdresses and feathered cloaks worn by warriors often indicated their achievements on the battlefield. Each feather added to a warrior's gear might signify a victory in battle, and the more elaborate the headdress, the higher the rank or prestige of the wearer. Warriors who had captured enemies in battle might wear headdresses adorned with hummingbird feathers, which symbolized the god Huitzilopochtli, the god of war and the sun. These feathers were seen as a spiritual armor, believed to provide the wearer with the divine protection and strength needed to succeed in battle. As we continue to discuss the importance of feathers in Aztec life, it's essential to remember that these decorative pieces were not just for display. They had profound religious and symbolic meaning. In the Aztec worldview, the gods were everywhere, and the use of feathers in clothing and adornments was a direct expression of the god's presence on earth. Featherwork was considered sacred, and only the most powerful and respected individuals could wear garments made from the rarest feathers. Historians still argue whether the elite's fascination with feathers was purely for status or if it had a deeper, more spiritual role in Aztec culture. Some believe the feathers had symbolic meaning beyond their beauty, representing a direct connection to the divine and the natural world. Others argue that the elaborate featherwork was primarily about displaying wealth and power. Regardless of the interpretation, one thing is clear. Feathers were a critical part of the Aztec wardrobe, signaling a person's divine favor, social rank, and accomplishments. Now, let's shift our focus a bit and look at how the environment itself shaped Aztec fashion. The geography of their homeland, with its hot sun and fluctuating temperatures, played a significant role in the way they adapted their clothing throughout the day. How did the landscape of the Aztec Empire influence the clothing choices of the people who lived there? Now that we've explored the importance of feathers in Aztec fashion, let's take a step back and consider how the environment shaped the way the Aztecs dressed. The geography of the Aztec Empire, with its hot sun, fluctuating temperatures, and varied landscape, had a profound influence on the clothing choices of the people who lived there. Their ability to adapt to such a diverse environment is a testament to their ingenuity and resourcefulness. The Aztecs lived in the highlands of central Mexico, specifically in a valley surrounded by mountains, which made their climate unique. The region was characterized by high altitude, temperate conditions, with relatively mild temperatures during the cooler months. However, the heat in the summer was intense, and the midday sun could be unforgiving. The combination of high altitude and direct sunlight created dramatic temperature fluctuations between day and night, which made it especially challenging to dress appropriately for the changing conditions. During the day, the heat of the sun was the most immediate concern. The Aztecs lived at an altitude of about 7,000 feet above sea level, which might have made the air thinner. But it also meant that the sun's rays were even more intense than they would have been at sea level. During the summer months, daytime temperatures could easily reach the low 90s, around 32 to 35 degrees, making it essential for the Aztecs to wear clothing that was light, breathable, and capable of providing shade. To cope with the extreme heat, the Aztecs wore garments that were minimalistic yet functional. The basic loincloth for men and the hupil for women, made from cotton, were perfect for allowing the skin to breathe and regulate temperature. These simple yet effective garments enabled the Aztecs to stay cool during the hottest part of the day. Layering was also a key feature of their clothing, The tilmatli, a rectangular cloth worn across the shoulders, could be added or removed depending on the temperature, offering protection against the sun when needed, but easily discarded when the heat became overwhelming. The simplicity and versatility of these garments were designed for adaptability, ensuring comfort in a landscape that required constant adjustments to the climate. At night, however, the temperatures dropped considerably. The cool evening air, coupled with the dryness of the valley, could make the nights quite chilly, especially in the higher elevations. The Aztecs were well aware of these temperature shifts, which meant that their clothing was designed to adapt to these changes. As the sun set and the temperatures dropped, they would layer up, often using cotton cloaks or additional garments made from thicker materials. The use of maguey fibers, which were stronger and more insulating, would provide added warmth during these cooler periods. The versatility of Aztec clothing, from the ability to shed layers during the heat of the day to adding warmth at night, was a clever adaptation to the valley's fluctuating temperatures. But temperature wasn't the only factor the Aztecs had to consider when designing their clothing. The terrain of the Valley of Mexico also played a role in shaping their fashion. Tenochtitlan, the capital of the Aztec Empire, was built on an island in Lake Texcoco, which meant the people had to deal with canals, causeways, and the occasional swampy patch of ground. For this reason, their clothing needed to be durable and practical enough to withstand the challenges of daily life in the city. Sandals, made from materials like maguey fibers and palm leaves, were ideal for navigating the wet and sometimes uneven terrain. These sandals were lightweight and comfortable, allowing the wearer to move easily through the canals, while providing enough protection to walk on the stone paths and through the market streets. The canals also had a particular influence on the design of their garments. With water frequently around them, the Aztecs needed garments that could dry quickly, especially if they were traveling or working near the lakes. The cotton clothing, while breathable, also dried relatively fast once wet, making it a practical choice in such a water-centric environment. Furthermore, the maguey sandals, often worn by the common folk, were perfect for walking in the shallow waters, as the plant fibers were durable enough to withstand constant exposure to moisture. In addition to the physical environment, the culture and religion of the Aztecs also impacted how they adapted their clothing to their surroundings. The Aztecs believed that their gods, particularly those connected to nature and the sun, were constantly influencing the world around them. Because of this, the sun and water were not only central to the climate, but also had symbolic significance in Aztec dress. As we saw with the feathers and other adornments, clothing was a direct link to the divine and a way to show respect for the forces that shaped their world. Historians still debate how much the geography of the Aztec Empire dictated the day-to-day lives of its people, including their clothing. Some scholars argue that the specific climatic conditions of the Valley of Mexico led to the development of the Aztecs' highly functional clothing system, while others suggest that their clothing choices were shaped as much by cultural norms and rituals as by environmental factors. It's likely that both played a role, while the environment certainly demanded practical solutions for surviving extreme heat and cold. The religious significance of clothing also dictated how garments were worn and styled. Ultimately, the Aztecs' fashion system was one that reflected both their practical survival needs and their cultural, spiritual, and social realities. Their clothing wasn't just something to wear. It was a reflection of their deep connection to their landscape, their gods, and their community. And as we look at the final aspects of their wardrobe, luxurious garments worn by the elite, we'll see how the elite's clothing helped reinforce their status and their spiritual connection to the divine. Now that we've covered how the environment shaped everyday clothing, it's time to dive into the clothing worn by the elite in Aztec society. While the commoners focused on surviving the heat, the nobility, priests, and warriors adorned themselves with garments that were not just functional, but deeply symbolic of their power, wealth, and connection to the divine. These luxurious clothes were a way for the elite to set themselves apart from the rest of society and demonstrate their elevated status. First and foremost, the most luxurious garments worn by the elite were elaborate feathered cloaks. As we've seen earlier, feathers were not only used for decoration, they were symbols of divine power. The wealthiest Aztecs, including the emperor and high-ranking priests, wore feathered cloaks that were made from the feathers of rare and sacred birds, such as the quetzal. These garments were woven with hundreds of feathers and often reached down to the ankles, making them both extravagant and awe-inspiring. The brilliance of these feathered cloaks symbolized the wearer's close relationship with the gods, particularly those connected to the heavens and the sun. The emperor himself wore a feathered cloak that was said to be one of the most magnificent pieces of attire in the entire empire. This cloak was carefully constructed with feathers from exotic birds, and the colors and patterns were designed to represent the emperor's divine right to rule. The emperor's garments, including his feathered cloak, were often crafted by a special group of artisans who were dedicated to creating these sacred garments. These artisans worked painstakingly to weave the feathers into intricate patterns that signified the emperor's strength and power, as well as his deep connection to the gods. In addition to feathered cloaks, nobles and priests also wore luxurious garments made from finely spun cotton. While the common people wore simpler cotton garments, the elite wore cotton textiles that were softer, finer, and more elaborately decorated. The cotton was often dyed in bright, symbolic colors such as red, blue, and purple, which were associated with important gods and celestial phenomena. These colors weren't just chosen for their aesthetic beauty, they were deliberately selected to honor the gods, symbolizing power, life, and sacrifice. A nobleman's attire was a constant reminder of his connection to divine forces. In addition to their clothing, the elite also had access to a variety of decorative accessories that further solidified their status. Gold jewelry, including necklaces, earrings, and bracelets, was a common feature of their attire. Gold was precious, rare, and highly symbolic, associated with the sun god Tonatiuh, and therefore, wearing gold signified a direct connection to the divine. The richness of gold jewelry made it a coveted possession, with intricate designs that often incorporated symbolic elements, such as animal motifs or representations of gods. These pieces weren't merely decorative, they were spiritual emblems, reinforcing the wearer's divine right to rule and their elevated status in society. For warriors, the luxurious attire wasn't limited to feathered cloaks and gold jewelry. As we saw earlier, their headdresses were often elaborate and symbolized both their military victories and their spiritual connection to the gods. Feathered headpieces were often worn by warriors to mark their achievements in battle. Each feather added to a warrior's headdress could signify a victory, and the more feathers they had, the greater their honor. These headdresses were not just for ceremonial use. They were an important part of the warrior's military identity. They were meant to intimidate enemies and instill fear, while also conveying the warrior's deep connection to Huitzilopochtli, the god of war. Historians still debate whether the lavishness of the elite clothing was primarily a symbol of wealth and status, or whether it had deeper spiritual and ritualistic significance. Some argue that the extravagant feathered cloaks and gold jewelry were simply symbols of power, used to distinguish the elite from the commoners. Others believe that the clothing, especially for priests and warriors, was tied to their ritual roles, representing their special relationship with the gods and their ability to mediate between the divine and the human world. Either way, one thing is clear. The clothing of the Aztec elite was both functional and deeply symbolic, reflecting their role as divine intermediaries and rulers of the empire. But the elite didn't just wear clothing and accessories to demonstrate their wealth and spiritual power. They also used their attire as a way to reinforce the social hierarchy. The difference between the clothing of the commoners and the nobles wasn't just about the quality of materials. It was about signaling one's role in society. The noble class had access to the finest cotton fabrics, the most vibrant dyes, and the most elaborate adornments, while the common people were limited to more practical, simpler clothing. This visual distinction helped maintain the rigid class system that was so central to Aztec society. Now, let's shift gears a bit and take a look at how the elite in Aztec society would prepare for the most important occasions. Rituals and ceremonies played a huge role in Aztec culture, and the clothing worn for these events was far more than just for show. It was about demonstrating spiritual power, paying homage to the gods, and reinforcing the social order. In these ceremonial settings, the clothing of the elite was taken to the next level, often incorporating not just feathers and gold, but also other sacred materials. Now that we've seen how the elite used clothing to signify wealth, power, and spiritual favor, let's dive deeper into how they dressed for the most significant occasions, rituals, and ceremonies. In Aztec society, the line between everyday clothing and ceremonial attire was not just blurred, it was practically non-existent. Clothing was an essential part of the spiritual world, and the garments worn during ceremonies were seen as symbols of divine favor, power, and the very connection between humans and the gods. One of the most important elements of Aztec ritual attire was its sacred symbolism. The clothing worn by priests, nobles, and warriors during religious ceremonies often incorporated not just ornamental items, but symbols that represented gods, celestial forces, and natural elements. These garments were more than just for decoration. They were seen as a conduit between the physical world and the divine. For example, priests performed many of the most sacred ceremonies in Aztec society, and their attire reflected their elevated status as intermediaries between the gods and the people. Priests wore special garments made from the finest cotton and often adorned with feathers from sacred birds. The featherwork on a priest's attire was not only decorative, but was meant to symbolize a connection to the divine. Certain colors and patterns were specifically chosen for their religious significance. Blue, representing the heavens, red, symbolizing life and sacrifice, and green, associated with fertility and the earth. These garments weren't just worn to indicate status. They were meant to reflect the priest's ability to channel divine power during the rituals they performed. Historians still debate how much of the religious meaning behind these garments was rooted in Aztec spirituality versus the need for the elites to maintain power. Some argue that the extravagant, symbolic clothing worn during ceremonies reinforced the elite's control over religious practices and their position in society. Others suggest that the clothing was truly a spiritual expression, meant to enable the wearer to serve as a divine conduit. Whatever the case, the importance of ceremonial clothing cannot be overstated. It was a crucial part of Aztec ritual life. But it wasn't just priests who wore elaborate attire for rituals. Warriors, too, dressed for battle and ceremony in ways that reinforced their spiritual connection to the gods. Their feathered headdresses, often made from exotic birds like the quetzal, symbolized not only their achievements in war, but their direct relationship with gods such as Huitzilopochtli, the god of war. A warrior's clothing and accessories became symbols of divine favor. For example, warriors who had captured enemies in battle might wear special garments that signified their victories, with each feather or decoration representing a particular achievement. These garments not only honored the gods, but acted as a public declaration of their strength and divine protection. The emperor, as the highest authority in Aztec society, also wore ceremonial garments that were designed to reinforce his role as the earthly representation of the gods. His feathered cloak, made from the finest and rarest feathers, was not just a display of wealth, but a sacred garment symbolizing his connection to the divine. His attire reflected his role as the intermediary between the gods and the people. And wearing such clothes elevated his stature and reinforced the belief in his divine right to rule. The emperor's most elaborate attire was often worn during the great ceremonial events that marked important religious dates, such as the new fire ceremony or the Feast of the Sun. These events were deeply important in Aztec culture, as they represented the renewal of the world and the reaffirmation of the emperor's connection to the gods. The clothing worn during these rituals was designed to ensure that the emperor could fulfill his sacred duties in front of the people and the gods. This ceremonial garb might have included not just feathers, cotton, and gold, but also precious stones like jade and turquoise, which were believed to have spiritual power. Beyond the emperor, other elite members of society, like the nobles and high-ranking priests, would also wear their most elaborate garments during religious events. These garments, though similar in material and structure to their everyday clothes, were adorned with even more precious materials. Gold, jade, feathers, and turquoise were often woven into the garments and jewelry of the elite during these times, making the clothing as much a spiritual offering as it was a display of wealth and power. It's important to note that the significance of these garments wasn't just about the materials used. It was about the rituals themselves. In many Aztec ceremonies, the clothing worn by the priests, warriors, and elites was meant to help them embody the gods they were worshiping. Whether it was through the sacred feathers that linked them to Quetzalcoatl, or the golden jewelry that connected them to Tonatiuh, the clothing was a physical manifestation of the divine. Historians still debate the exact role of clothing in Aztec religious rituals. Was it purely symbolic, or did it play a functional role in the ceremony itself? Some argue that the clothing was meant to help channel divine power, making the wearer a more effective intermediary between the gods and the people. Others believe that the lavishness and ceremonial clothing were primarily tools of political and social control, reinforcing the status and authority of the elites. What is clear as to, however, is that the attire worn for rituals was integral to Aztec religious life, both as a means of worship and as a way of demonstrating the divine connection of the elites. Now, as we've reached the end of this journey through the fashion of the Aztecs, let's slow things down a bit. The intense heat, the carefully chosen fabrics, the divine symbolism of feathers and jewelry, all of it came together to help the Aztecs navigate their daily lives and their complex spiritual world. And in the cool of the evening, as the sun set and the day's heat subsided, the Aztecs would begin to wind down, taking off the layers that had kept them cool and protected, knowing that tomorrow the sun would rise again.